Workshops Go. 19th Century African American Life History Series. Plantation Living. 1. So many kids see no way out of the situations they were born into. You are helping others. Show these kids that there is life after gangs and poverty. I applaud UAP, St. Louis, Missouri. Comments about our workshops. We train trainers, that's what we do. 3. 19th Century African American Life History Series Plantation Living. Slave Church Service, CC 1845. Just about everything that you need to know about the lives of African Americans in the 19th century. This is a series of workshops that will teach homeschooling youth and young adults about the lives of African Americans in the 19th century. 4. In this age of technology, our youth and young adults need to know about the history of African Americans. 5. Here are workshops that provides a historical discussion of the lives of and what really happened to African American in the 19th century. A slave's decision about whether or not to run away was based largely on his quality of life as a slave. 6. When historians try to study the quality of slave life in the South, they find that it is hard to make generalizations. 7. This is because a slave's quality of life depended on many things. 8. 1. Who his master was. 2. The nature of the work being done for the master. And 3. Where the plantation or master's house was located. 9. 10. Slave cabin, CC 1855. In general, slaves living on rural plantations in the Carolinas were not treated very well. These slaves grew rice, which required a lot of hard labor. 11. Rice plantations needed the work of many slaves, and often there were hundreds of slaves working for one family. 12. This had two important impacts on slave life. One is that because the slave owner did not get to know each individual slave, he found it easier to be cruel to them. 13. Most big plantations had overseers who would whip and beat the slaves if they did not work fast or hard enough. 14. The other effect of having many slaves on one plantation is that many of them lived together in slave quarters. 15. The slave quarters were very small and poorly built huts that would get cold at night. 16. The good thing about all of the slaves living together was that they could develop a sense of community and be with their families. 17. Digging and picking peanuts by hand, CC 1845. Even though it was considered a luxury to be able to live with your family, most slaves did not want to work on large rural cotton or rice plantation because of the dangerous work, cruel treatment, and disease that thrived in the warm climate. 18. Another benefit of living in the city was that slave owners did not want a reputation of being cruel to their slaves, so they were less likely to abuse them physically. 19. Cutting tobacco, Southside, Virginia, C. 1872. Some slaves even formed close relationships with their masters or mistresses, who paternalistically manumit them when they died. 20. In general, life as a slave in a city was better than on a plantation. But more importantly, cities provided many opportunities to escape to freedom. 21. Digging and picking peanuts by machine, C. 1877. Rural life in Virginia. After the Civil War, farming in Virginia changed dramatically. The most obvious reason for this was emancipation. 22. The end of slavery, along with the destruction caused by the war, led to the breakup of many of the largest plantations in the state. 23. Many planters entered into labor contracts with former slaves, and a system known as sharecropping emerged. 24. Sharecropping is exactly what the name suggests, a system under which both landowner and tenant receive a share of the crop. For the tenant, this was usually about 1/3. 25. Landowners advanced sharecroppers seed, fertilizer, and provisions in exchange for labor. Sharecroppers planted and tended the crops and cared for livestock. 26. The proceeds were divided after the harvest in the fall. 27. In theory, and sometimes in practice, both owner and tenant benefited from the system. The landowner benefited because he did not have to pay wages to a worker on a daily or weekly basis. 28. The sharecropper benefited because he received food and shelter. 29. For sharecroppers who were former slaves, sharecropping provided an additional incentive. 30. Under that system, freedmen worked for themselves. They labored on their own and not in gangs, as had been the case under slavery. 31. More importantly, freedmen, as heads of household, maintained control over the activities of their wives and children, a circumstance that also contrasted with conditions under slavery. 32. In reality, the system more often worked to benefit the landowner. Sometimes sharecroppers were cheated out of wages, and disputes were almost always decided in the landowner's favor. 33. And the accumulation of debt made the sharecropper's nominal control over his family meaningless. 34. The practice of sharecropping was more widespread in areas of the state where staple crops, such as cotton, peanuts, and tobacco, were grown. 35. Tobacco remained Virginia's most important cash crop, but tobacco growing changed as the popularity of cigarettes increased. 36. The tobacco used in cigarettes was bright leaf tobacco, which grew best in the Southside counties that bordered North Carolina, Pittsylvania, Halifax, and Mecklenburg. 37. In these areas, rates of sharecropping remained high. 38. Conversely, in the Piedmont, where the less popular dark tobacco had been grown, sharecropping was less prevalent in black. Land ownership was greater. 39. In 1890, for example, 76% of African American heads of household in Louisa County owned land. In Halifax, the number was only 14%. 40. What neither planters nor laborers fully understood at the time was the degree to which Virginia's farms were integrated into a national market economy. 41. Steamships and railroads transported Virginia products across the nation, indeed around the world. 42. African Americans working on a dock. C. 1879. Oysters harvested from the Chesapeake Bay in the early morning were served to patrons in New York restaurants later that same day. 43. The development of transportation networks benefited such extractive industries as mining, fishing, and timbering, and changed the landscape of rural Virginia. 44. Timber companies quickly stripped the state's mountains of their hardwood forests. 45. The sparse population in southwest Virginia forced coal mining companies to construct entire towns to provide for miners and their families. 46. In the northern neck, Reedville became the center for the Manhattan industry, and fish factories processed this small bony fish into fertilizer, oil, and meal for poultry. 47. Lumbering, Western Virginia, c. 1891. The depressions that marked American society in the late 19th century greatly affected farmers. By the 20th century, however, crop prices began to rise. 48. In fact, the first 2 decades of the 20th century are viewed today as a golden age for American agriculture. 49. With more money in their pockets, farmers purchased tractors and other machinery, making their farms more productive and efficient. 50. The turn of the 20th century also saw the emergence of a new field of study, agricultural science, that focused on improving rural life. 51. Agricultural experiment stations were established in Blacksburg and Arlington. Eventually, extension agents were placed in every county to educate farmers about everything from improving livestock to preventing crop diseases. 52. Hay wagon, Shenandoah Valley, 1899. Perhaps the era's most famous agricultural scientist was George Washington Carver. He was just one of a number of experts who worked with farmers to improve the quality of their crops. 53. Carver is most famous for discovering numerous uses for the peanut. He was also instrumental in his advocacy of the soybean, a crop that revitalized farms in eastern Virginia. 54. The golden age of agriculture ended with the close of World War I. For many farmers, the Great Depression was just a continuation of hard times that began around 1920. 55. Virginia farmers tended to fare better than farmers elsewhere, largely because of the prevalence of truck and dairy farming and the continued popularity of tobacco. 56. Nonetheless, drought and the Great Depression in the late 1920s and early 1930s hit Virginia farmers especially hard. It would take another world war to help them recover. 57. That war would also bring about the kinds of changes, consolidation, mechanization, and rationalization that occurred in the first 2 decades of the century. 58. Just about everything that you need to know about the lives of African Americans in the 19th century. 19th Century African American Life History Series. Online 19th Century African American History Series. Living in Washington, D.C. 45 minutes. Online 19th Century African American History Series. Plantation Living. 45 minutes. Online 19th Century African American History Series. The Great Migration North. 45 minutes. Online 19th Century African American History Series. Jim Crow Laws. 45 minutes. Online 19th Century African American History Series. Emancipation Proclamation. 45 minutes. Online 19th Century African American History Series. Buffalo Soldiers. 45 minutes. Online 19th Century African American History Series. Educating Black Children in the South. 45 minutes. A 19th Century Washington, D.C. love story. Pearl and the Buffalo Soldier. 67. Grandmother Jane. An American love story in 19th century Richmond, Virginia 1848 to 1938. 68. Booker T-isms. Quotes by Booker T. Washington. Since 2008 we have trained the staffs of thousands of organizations nationwide. Author D. Harold Green is the owner of Workshops Go. Our 18th YearFaith Institute, headquartered in Jacksonville, North Carolina, is one of only two African-American-owned, national and international education technology training companies in the United States. The goal of SkilledForceJOB National Community Trainer Academy is to develop a full-time national, community-centric, workforce readiness, entrepreneurship, and life preparation skills, soft skills, Train the Trainer Academy program. Visit our website at https://www.faithinstitute.org/about-us.html. Our workshops can teach students how to work in a manufacturing plant, or they can learn how to start their own manufacturing business. D. Harold Green, CCMT. More comments about our workshops. We train trainers, that's what we do. A simplified online training infrastructure, simplified certificate training, easy access online workshops, reduced training costs, reduced days off for training. We offer Workshops Go 19th Century African American Life History Series. Reduced travel expenses for training, access to over 200 online workshops, workforce readiness skills, start a business skills, life preparation skills. Workshops Go 19th Century African American Life History Series. No setup fees. Start immediately. Specify single workshops. $4,799, 100 plus attendees. $5,949, 150 plus attendees. $7,969, 200 plus attendees. 1 year subscription plan. We train trainers, that's what we do. For more information, contact D.Harold Green, CCMT. Workshops Go, a division of Faith Institute of Entrepreneurship Incorporated. Jacksonville, North Carolina, 285-469-10-679-4319. Email trainers@faithinstitute.org.